G'day everyone, and welcome to my first video in this series on Canadian history for high school students. Today I'd like to begin with a short introduction to what history is, why it's important, what historical evidence is, and finally historical bias or perspective. So let's begin by going back to ancient Greece and a man named Herodotus who lived between 484 and 425 BCE, or before the Common Era. We often refer to him as the father of history. This is because he actually wrote a book called The Histories, which is believed to be one of the earliest, if not the earliest, written accounts of the entire past of a society, in this case his own ancient Greece. And he goes back several centuries prior to what was considered the golden age of Greece when he lived, which was around the time that democracy happened. The word historia, which is where the histories comes from, means in ancient Greece inquiry or knowledge through investigation, which describes a little bit about what history is. It's not just looking at names or places or dates. There's an investigation process to it. There's evidence that goes along with it, much like a science in some ways. At its core, it's, in my opinion, stories about human successes and failures. History shows us not only where we came from, but where we're going and whether or not we're learning from our past mistakes. The next few slides, I want to just show some examples of some of humankind's various successes and failures, not just from Canadian history, but world history. And we're going to go all the way back again to ancient Greece, to one of my favorite stories, the Battle of Thermopylae. Some of you may be familiar with this from the movie 300 by Zack Snyder, which was based on a graphic novel by Frank Miller, which is actually based on this true historical event, where a group of Spartans and some other Greek allies got together to block a mountain pass called Thermopylae to prevent a Persian army from invading mainland Greece. And as the story goes, after 3 days, the Spartans and the other Greeks were decimated. They had lost the battle. Most of them had been killed, and the Persians moved into ancient Greece, into mainland Greece, and started conquering whatever they came across. The significance of this particular event is the fact that prior to this, most of Greece were individual city-states. They had their own governments, and they fought and picked at each other. And for the first time in their recorded history, they actually came together as a united nation to fend off a common enemy. Next, we'll go to 370 BC and a man named Hippocrates, which is an ancient Greek physician who is often credited with something called the Hippocratic Oath. There are arguments that you can look up on your own as to whether or not this actually came from Hippocrates, but the important thing about the oath is it was created, a couple thousand years ago, and it still stands today. Modern doctors take this oath, they take this promise when they become physicians, to put the patient's care and their needs first, to not do them any harm, to not take any action that could make them worse, and to maintain their privacy. Moving on, the destruction of Pompeii from 79 CE. A volcano called Vesuvius erupted and buried an entire ancient city called Pompeii under a very thick layer of hardened ash. Pompeii was located on the west coast of Italy, and it's significant because about 300 years ago, they started excavating this city. They had forgotten about it for many, many centuries, and scientists started excavating it, and the ash, just the way it had fallen and hard packed, preserved much of the city. A lot of what we know today about ancient Rome, ancient Italy, how Romans lived, what they ate, how they dressed, how they conducted business, how they lived in their homes. A lot of this comes from how well the city was preserved for the 2,000 years since the eruption. Continuing on, the Crusades, which was a 200-year conflict between the Catholic Church and the followers of Islam in the Middle East. It was all about who would control the holy city of Jerusalem, which is a significant location in both religions. It wasn't just one conflict. It lasted, as I said, about 200 years, and there were multiple conflicts with breaks in between. So you'll hear about the First Crusade, the Second Crusade, the Third Crusade. But overall, it's believed that between 2 and 6 million people died as a result of these particular events. Next, we have the Gutenberg Bible, which was produced around 1450 CE. This was the first book that was mass printed and distributed. Before this, if you wanted a copy of a written text, you actually had to take a copy of it and write out a new copy for yourself, or have someone who could write it out for you. But with the Bible, this was the first time that a book was mass printed and made available to anyone who wanted a copy or could afford to buy a copy. And this helped pave the way for printing of books that we see today, newspapers, magazines, and eventually the creation of the internet in order to easily share information to as many people as possible. Into the 1500s, we come to Galileo Galilei. He was certainly not the first astronomer, but he was important in that he did invent the first practical handheld telescope, which he used to make observations, the first observations of sunspots, of craters on the moon, and noticed that some of the outer planets, like Jupiter and Saturn, also had moons orbiting them. And this, of course, opened up science and our perception of the universe in that, okay, there is certainly more out there than this little ball of mud and water that we all live on. Into the 20th century, we come to the sinking of the RMS, or Royal Mail Ship Titanic, the largest luxury liner of the time. It sank after it grazed an iceberg near the coast of Newfoundland. There were about 2,200 people on board, and more than 1,500 people died as a result of this sinking. At the time, there was a lot of arrogance about how safe traveling across the ocean could be, especially with these really large ships that came out, like the Titanic. And after this sinking, a lot of changes were made to how we traveled across the ocean by boat, including how many lifeboats would be aboard, how radio operations would be conducted, which was a fairly new invention at the time, how fast you would travel through hazardous areas, like areas where you knew there would likely be icebergs, that sort of thing. Next, we have the Trinity Project from 1945. This was the effort by the American military to create and detonate the first nuclear weapon. The purpose was to try and bring a close to World War II. There were fears that Germany was working on something like this for Hitler, so the Americans stepped in, wanting to create it first in order to use it as a deterrent and bring a quick end to the war. By the time the project was completed, Hitler and Nazi Germany had surrendered, but there was still a bit of a conflict between the US and Japan at the time, and in order to demonstrate this weapon and in order to prevent any future conflicts or aggression against the U.S. or its allies, 2 bombs were made and dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, resulting in over 200,000 deaths. Into the later half of the 20th century, we come to Apollo 11. It took 10 years to put a human being on the moon for the first time, and much like the Trinity project, it began as a competition between 2 countries, in this case the United States and the Soviet Union, to see who could get someone on the moon first. Early on, the Soviets were leading what was then called the space race. They had put the first satellite in orbit, they had put the first astronaut in orbit around the Earth, but eventually the US program caught up and surpassed. And in July 1969, the Eagle lander set foot on the surface of the moon, and the first 2 human beings to walk on its surface were Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. This event, much like Galileo, suddenly opened up a new age of space exploration, and before long we had the space shuttles, we had the International Space Station, and we were sending remote probes to the surface of Mars to explore there, the moons of the outer planets like Jupiter and Saturn, the inner planets like Venus, Mercury, the Sun, and ended up putting several telescopes in orbit like the Hubble, which then discovered various Earth-like planets light years away. In 1970, around 1970, the internet was created. Again, as a result of a U.S. military project to electronically connect their bases via communication, something beyond radio. It has since gone on to become this global system for sharing information, for sharing ideas, entertainment, and pretty much anything else you can think of. September 11, 2001, we have what is still called 9/11. This was a tragedy where religious extremists hijacked 4 commercial airplanes in the United States. 2 collided with the World Trade Center in New York, 1 collided with the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and 1 crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. And between the people on the planes and the people in these other locations, New York and Washington, more than 3,000, well, nearly 3,000 people died, representing 100 different countries. And this came to change the way we travel by air, much like how the Titanic disaster changed sea travel. 9/11 changed security and precautions in relation to how we move about the skies around the planet. More current is the COVID-19 pandemic, or the coronavirus pandemic. It started in 2019 in China, and to date, as of this recording, more than 650 million people have caught it, and out of those, 6.7 million people have died from it. And while things seem to have settled down, again, at the time of this recording, there are new variants that seem to be coming out fairly regularly, new vaccines that we have to keep up on, and periods where people are still more comfortable wearing masks than not. So this is, as of this recording, a continuing and ongoing issue. The death of Queen Elizabeth II, this is our last example from September 8, 2022. Currently, the reigning King of England is Charles III, but prior to him was his mother, Queen Elizabeth. who took over after her father, King George VI, died in 1953. She's very significant because she's the longest reigning monarch in British history. She was queen for 70 years, more than any other king, any other queen in England's history up until her point. In her time as Canada's head of state and the head of state of other Commonwealth nations like the UK, like Australia, and some others, she visited Canada 22 times, and her last visit before her passing was in 2010. On this slide, I have a quote from a movie I rather enjoy, The Da Vinci Code. It was from 2006 and stars Tom Hanks as a historian, a symbologist named Dr. Robert Langdon. The actual history, the religious history covered in the movie, how much of it is valid, how much of it is based on actual events, is certainly debatable and has been debated in multiple forums. I'm not going to offer any type of opinion in this video. However, there is a quote near the end, which is very significant to what we're talking about, where Tom Hanks says, "It's why we study history, so we'll stop killing each other." Going back to what I said earlier, this is why it's important. Many people ask, why do we have to study history? Why do we care about what happened in the past? Well, as I said, it's to see where we've been, where we're going, and are we learning? Because nobody wants another 9/11, nobody wants another Crusades, nobody wants another World War II. So it's important to look at these events, see what happened, why they happened, learn from them so we can do better moving forward as a species, as a society. Now that we've covered why we study history, how do we study history? And as I hinted earlier, very much like in science, we use evidence to put together a picture of what happened and when it happened. You don't just say, oh, this happened 2,000 years ago because. No, we need more than that. And also, like in science, as new evidence is discovered, ideas of what happened in the past may change. For example, 1,000 years ago, possibly longer, people thought the Earth was flat. Now, we have solid scientific evidence, not the least of which are photographs from space, photographs from orbit, that show the Earth is round. Similar in history. 50 years ago, most Canadians didn't know anything about residential schools, about Indigenous residential schools. It wasn't something that was talked about in Indigenous communities. It wasn't something that was talked about in public, in schools, in the newspaper. But in the 1990s, a bunch of brave survivors of the residential school system came forward, started telling their story. It got national attention, and now we are aware of what happened as a nation. We are aware that these children were taken, that they were mistreated horribly, that they were forced to abandon much of their cultural heritage in order to be assimilated into white Canadian society, and then the traumas that have happened since then from generation to generation. Now it's required that Canadian students know about residential schools, learn about residential schools and what happened, where when I was a student, I knew nothing about it. It was not something we talked about, and from most Canadians' perspective, it wasn't an event. It was, we didn't know if anything was going on. And this is a very, very recent change. And this is the result of evidence, such as survivors coming forward, people going back and looking at admission records to these schools, death records from these schools, government reports, budgets, things of those nature, right? The evidence was gathered to paint a picture of what actually went on. And now that knowledge is being passed down, and our perception of that whole event in Canada's history has changed. And now we're asking, okay, this happened. How do we move forward? Historical evidence itself comes in two categories: primary sources and secondary sources. Primary sources, these are evidence that is left behind by people who were directly involved in historical events. For example, oral histories. Again, going back to Indigenous people in Canada, right? We know what happened in Indigenous society 500, 1,000, 5,000 years before Europeans settled in North America, because Indigenous people verbally recorded their cultural history, their cultural heritage, and passed that knowledge, passed those histories from generation to generation to generation until the modern day when people started writing this information down. Okay? And because that information started with people that actually lived in those times, we consider it a primary source. Photographs and videos are also considered primary sources. So, anytime you post a picture on Instagram, on Snapchat, on Facebook, or whatever social media you use, or video on those applications, you are recording a piece of your history and making it available for other people to look at, and that is a primary source. Interviews with people who have lived through a particular event, like, again, survivors who survived the residential school system, or people, soldiers who fought in World War I and wrote letters home, which have survived. These are considered primary sources. Human, animal, or plant remains, very valuable to archaeologists. Looking at the remains of people, of animals, of plants that have been preserved over time tell us a lot about life, before writing and beyond. How many people may have been male or female in a particular group? What kind of occupations did they have? Were they royalty? Were they a slave? Were they a scientist? Were they an artist? Were they a baker? Were they an engineer? What did they eat? Did they have pets? Did they have livestock? Did they domesticate animals? And all these things come from these organic remains that have been left behind. And at the same time, tools, weapons, or other personal objects like, say, mirrors or hairpins that have also been left behind and have been preserved over time provide similar pictures, similar information to how people lived and what they did and what their occupations might have been, and are considered primary sources because they were left behind by people who actually lived in these periods. Secondary sources, this is evidence or opinions that have been created by somebody who was not directly involved in the events they're talking about, but may be using primary sources or other secondary sources. For example, a textbook, right? Textbooks are not, textbooks that talk about World War I are not necessarily written by somebody who actually fought in World War I. They are looking at newspaper articles, they are looking at letters from soldiers, they are, looking at grave sites of fallen soldiers to come to this information. Same with encyclopedias. Encyclopedias talking about what happened during the time of Shakespeare. Research or magazine articles, documentaries or movies based on historical events, or informational websites. Very rarely are these particular types of documents created by people who actually lived the events they're talking about. So we consider them secondary sources. Now, finally, let's take a look at historical opinion or historical bias. I mean, it's fine to have an opinion about what you think happened in history, or why something happened in history, or what the facts of a particular historical event were. But if you don't support it, that's considered bias. We need to ask how reliable the sources are we're using before we make our own conclusions. And we might need to check several different sources on that topic. In fact, it's highly recommended you don't. You do, and we'll get into more of that why in a minute. But it's highly recommended that you do check multiple sources on the topic to see if that information is shared or if it's just being offered by one person and it's only one person's opinion or bias on what happened and it's such and such a date or such and such a time, such and such a place. So yeah, a bias, just as the point of providing a definition for you students, it's a personal opinion or belief about a specific person, a group, a thing, an idea, or an event. That's it. It's just an opinion. I believe that. That's a bias. That's an opinion. So we need to take our biases, we need to take our opinions, and we need to support them with evidence. And in verifying sources and verifying evidence, there are questions you should consider before considering the information you're looking at, or the event that you're looking at is a historical quote unquote fact. For example, who created the source, right? Was the source written by a male or a female? Was the source written by someone who was poor or someone who was educated? Was the source written by a scientist or by a carpenter, right? When was the source created? Was the source created yesterday, which would very likely have the most up-to-date information we have available on that particular topic, that particular event, or was it created 100 years ago, right? And again, looking at the residential school system, where, as I said, 100 years ago, most Canadians knew nothing about this, and we had some very different ideas about what Indigenous people, First Nations people in Canada, what they were like. You look at a textbook from that period, and and it refers to Indigenous people not as Indigenous people, but as Indians, and they describe them as savage or uncivilized. 100 years later, we now know this is not the case. They are not Indians. They are First Nations. They are Indigenous. They are certainly not uncivilized. They are certainly not savage. They have a rich cultural history, art, music, spiritual beliefs. They may be different to Western ideals, but they are no less valid. And so because, the information presented 100 years ago is very different from information presented yesterday, it's important to look at that. Look at, when was this produced? How likely is it that this source has been tampered with over time? Wikipedia, prime example. Great website to look at as a starting point to find information about an event or a person that you might be reading about in history, but certainly not the be-all and end-all. And that's because anyone can go onto Wikipedia and change it, right? You cannot take Wikipedia as a sole source of fact because it can very easily be tampered with, right? So if you're looking at a website or a Wikipedia and you're looking at Genghis Khan, and I honestly don't know what the actual entry says, but if it says something to the effect of, okay, 20% of all people that live today are descended from Genghis Khan because of all the women he assaulted while he was running around conquering China. All right, well, that's one source. You should really look at other sources, National Geographic article, encyclopedias, articles written by scholarly professors who may be looking at documents that were written at the time Genghis Khan ruled that part of the world, to see if, was this actually accurate? Did he actually go around and bed that many people? What is the scientific proof that many people living today are actually descended from this one human being? So you need to look at multiple sources because, the one you're examining could very well be tampered with. And it's the same with photographs. It's the same with videos. Don't take any one source on its face as a fact to base an opinion on. Which leads us to, are there other sources? So again, Genghis Khan, 20% of all people that live today are descended from Genghis Khan. All right, that's one source. How many other sources support this? Right? How many other sources support the reasoning for this? Is it just the one source, or are there 10? And that's an important question to ask. And last, are the perspectives of other people or groups included as a part of this source? So, most history, up until the last 50 or 60 years, has been written by white, educated males. And that's just, the truth of it. There have been some exceptions here and there, where a minority person has left behind some kind of historical documentation about something. But looking at a summary of history, it's mostly written by white educated males. So, if you're looking at a source and it's written by a white male, is it just the white male perspective that person is talking about? Or does that source also include what was happening to African Americans at the time, what was happening to Asians at the time, what was happening to Jewish people at the time, what was happening to First Nations people at the time, what was happening to women at the time? Are there more than one? Is there more than one perspective, one opinion beyond the author's culture, gender, age, occupation included in that source? The more differing perspectives there are that have been built into that source, the more reliable that information probably is. And again, you look at many classroom textbooks today, and it's not just one person writing it. It's a collaboration of different people from different locations and different educational backgrounds and different cultural backgrounds, which makes things like a school textbook a lot more valid of a source today than they would have been 50, 60, 100 years ago. Okay. So that is our introduction to what history is, why it's important, and how we need to critically consider our opinions and the evidence that we're being presented, where this evidence comes from, and what kinds of questions we should ask for it before we go, this is a fact of what happened at such and such a time. So thank you for listening. And if you have any questions or any constructive comments that you would like to offer, please feel free to leave something in the comments section below. And thank you for listening.